You are in Paris. It is 1924. You are sitting in a cafe on the left bank. Not one of the grand, tourist-facing establishments of the boulevards, but one of the specific, small, slightly dingy cafes of the Rue de la Huchette or the Rue Mouffetard, the kind of place where the zinc bar is permanently occupied by the same four people, and the owner knows everyone's name and nobody's business. The coffee is genuinely excellent. The wine is cheap. The ashtray on your table has not been emptied since approximately Tuesday. Around you, the specific world of 1920s Paris is in full operation. At the next table, two Americans are arguing about whether Hemingway is a genius or merely very good at describing fishing. Across the room, a woman in a bobbed haircut and extremely red lipstick is reading a manuscript with the focused attention of someone who is either editing or crying, and it is not immediately clear which. Someone is playing the piano in the back room. Not well, but with conviction, which in Paris in 1924 was considered an adequate substitute. Paris in the 1920s was the specific, extraordinary, probably unrepeatable cultural moment that we know as the interwar period, the decade between the end of the First World War and the beginning of the Great Depression, the specific window of time when the city was simultaneously at the center of European modernity and at the epicenter of a crisis whose dimensions the people living through it hadn't quite grasped yet. The lost generation was here. The American expatriates who had come to Paris because it was cheaper and because it was Paris, and because the United States had prohibition and Paris had wine, and the combination of these factors made the left bank the most interesting zip code in the world. Hemingway was here. Fitzgerald was here. Gertrude Stein was here, holding her salon on the Rue de Fleurus. Picasso was here, although he was no longer especially impressed by it. Joyce was here working on Ulysses, which he was finishing slowly in the specific way of a man who was also going blind and who had somehow still ended up with the most demanding book project of the century. The art was extraordinary. The music was extraordinary. The fashion was extraordinary. The parties were extraordinary. The intellectual life of the city in this specific decade produced the modernist literature and the cubist art and the surrealist manifestos and the jazz clubs and the couture houses and the film experiments and the political philosophy that the 20th century would spend the rest of its duration arguing about, and running through all of it, not exclusively, not defining the decade, but present in it, woven into the specific social fabric of the specific world that the 1920s Paris was heroin. Not marijuana, which was the drug of the jazz musicians and the Montmartre nightlife, but which occupied a different social position. Not cocaine, which was the drug of the wealthy and the ambitious, and had its own separate story in this period. Heroin, diacetyl morphine, the specific opioid that the Bayer Pharmaceutical Company had synthesized in 1898, had sold legally as a cough suppressant and a pain reliever, and that the subsequent decades had transformed from the pharmacy shelf into the specific substance that the 1920s drug underground was distributing with considerable commercial enthusiasm. The heroin craze of 1920s Paris is not a story that appears prominently in the mythology of the decade. The mythology of the 1920s, Paris emphasizes the champagne and the jazz and the literary brilliance and the fashion revolution and the specific golden haze of the Belle Epoque's aftermath. The heroin is there in the historical record for anyone who looks in the police files, in the medical records, in the memoirs, in the biographies of the artists and writers who were involved with it, in the newspaper accounts of the drug panic that periodically swept through through the French press. It is there, and the story of how it got there, what it did when it arrived, who used it and who sold it, and who was destroyed by it and who managed it, and who eventually attempted to address it. This is the story that the mythology of the lost generation has mostly left out. Let's put it back in. Chapter 1. The drug that medicine built. How heroin arrived in Paris, and why nobody thought it was a problem. The Bayer company was very proud of heroin. This is worth establishing at the outset, because the modern association of Bayer with aspirin, the more innocent pharmaceutical product that the company is primarily remembered for, tends to obscure the fact that in 1898, the company was equally enthusiastic about both of its new products, and the name Heroin was the specific brand name that Bayer had given to its diacetyl morphine synthesis, derived from the German heroisch, meaning heroic, because the company thought it had a heroic quality that set it apart from the existing opiates. The specific quality that the Bayer scientists had identified was its apparent superiority to morphine as a cough suppressant, combined with the specific claim, based on the early clinical trials, whose design would not survive the scrutiny of the modern clinical trial standards, that heroin was less addictive than morphine. This claim was a specific medical catastrophe of the late 19th century's pharmaceutical enthusiasm, the assertion that the new, more potent opiate was the treatment for morphine addiction. The morphine addiction problem was real and significant by the late 19th century. The medical use of morphine as a pain reliever through the second half of the 19th century, its administration by the hypodermic syringe that the 1850s had introduced, its wide distribution during and after the American Civil War and the Franco-Prussian War, had produced a substantial population of medically addicted patients whose dependence was a recognized clinical problem. The heroin that Bayer was offering was, by the specific pharmacological logic of the 1890s, the solution, and for a brief period, it was used as such. Administered to morphine-addicted patients as a cure, with the initially encouraging results that the drug's euphoric effect produced before the addiction dynamic revealed itself. The specific pharmacological reality that the 1898 clinical enthusiasm had missed was the specific fact that heroin crosses the blood-brain barrier faster and more completely than morphine. The diacetyl groups that Bayer's synthesis had added to the morphine molecule made it more lipid-soluble and therefore more rapidly absorbed into the brain, producing a more intense initial effect that the addiction pharmacology produces more rapidly and more powerfully than the morphine it was supposed to replace. Heroin was more addictive than morphine, not less. The specific medical claim of 1898 was the specific medical error that the subsequent decades of addiction medicine corrected at considerable human cost. But before the correction arrived, heroin was legal, commercially available, and genuinely widely distributed. In France, the pharmaceutical regulation of the late 19th century had not anticipated the specific problem that the powerful new opiate synthesized from a natural source that was itself unregulated would create. The pharmacies stocked it. The doctors prescribed it. The medical literature discussed it with the enthusiasm of the period's pharmaceutical optimism. The First World War changed the drug landscape of Europe in ways that the peacetime regulation had not anticipated. The war's medical requirements, the massive scale of the casualties, the specific pain management demands of the wound care on the Western Front, the availability of morphine and the other opiates as the primary tools of pain management in the military medical system, produced a significant population of veterans who had encountered opiates in the medical context and who arrived home in 1918 with the specific combination of traumatic experience and the physiological and psychological vulnerability that the opioids' effects addressed. The demobilization of the armies produced, in Paris as in every European city, the specific influx of the traumatized, the damaged, and the economically dislocated that the transition from the wartime economy to the peacetime economy generated. The veterans who returned to Paris returned to a city that was economically disrupted, socially transformed by the war's casualties, and the social changes that the wartime had accelerated, and in the specific state of the collective post-traumatic condition that the period would only later develop the language to describe. The drug supply had changed while the war was happening. The international opium trade that the pre-war period had allowed to function with the relative freedom of the pre-regulation era had been disrupted by the war, but it had also been transformed. The wartime demand for morphine for the military medical services had stimulated the production of opium derivatives at a scale that the peacetime demand could not absorb, and the transition to peace left a specific overproduction that the criminal networks that had developed during the wartime disruption were positioned to distribute through the channels that the pre-war trade had established. The Harrison Narcotics Tax Act of 1914 in the United States, the specific federal legislation that regulated the manufacture, importation, production, and distribution of opiates and cocaine, had pushed a portion of the American drug trade toward Europe, where the regulation was less comprehensive. The British Dangerous Drugs Act of 1920 had similarly disrupted the UK's drug supply networks. The French regulation was developing, but had not yet achieved the comprehensive control that the international drug control movement was pushing toward. The result in Paris of the early 1920s was the specific situation of the drug supply meeting the demand in the particular social conditions of the post-war city. The supply from the disrupted pharmaceutical industry and the developing criminal networks, the demand from the traumatized veterans, and the specific cultural experimentation of the interwar Bohemia, and the regulatory environment that had not yet caught up with the specific scale of the problem. The heroin that arrived in 1920s, Paris was arriving through multiple channels. The legitimate pharmaceutical channel still existed. Heroin was available through the pharmacy system in France, with the prescription requirement that the regulatory evolution was imposing, but that the specific application was not yet consistently enforcing. The illegitimate channel, the criminal network that was developing the specific infrastructure of the modern drug trade, was growing in the specific space that the regulatory inconsistency and the international supply disruption created. The price was accessible, not cheap in the way that the later heroin markets would become. The specific economies of scale that the criminal supply infrastructure was developing in the 1920s had not yet reduced the price to the levels that would define the later decades of the drug trade, but accessible to the specific population of the Bohemian left bank, the artists and writers and musicians and the various hangers-on of the specific cultural world that Paris in the 1920s had assembled. Chapter 2. The Culture, How Heroin Fit into the Specific Social World of 1920s Paris. The Afro-specific social world of 1920s Paris had a complicated relationship with transgression. The complexity was the complexity of a culture that was simultaneously celebrating transgression as the specific aesthetic program of the avant-garde and experiencing transgression as the specific psychological response to the trauma of the war. The Bohemian culture of Montparnasse and Montmartre, the specific neighborhoods that the artistic community had colonized and that the tourist mythology of 1920s Paris has made canonical, was a culture that had identified the rejection of bourgeois convention as both an artistic and a personal value. The rejection of bourgeois convention in the specific context of the 1920s meant the rejection of the sobriety and the respectability and the specific moral code of the pre-war French middle class that the war had comprehensively discredited in the minds of the generation that had survived it. The generation that had watched 4 years of industrialized killing in the name of the values that the pre-war European civilization had celebrated. The duty, the heroism, the sacrifice, the patriotism had arrived at the specific post-war position of the thoroughly disillusioned. The disillusionment expressed itself in the specific aesthetic of the avant-garde, the Dada movement's systematic destruction of the pretensions of the established art world, the Surrealists' systematic exploration of the unconscious as the specific territory that the rational, ordered civilization had ignored, and that the war had revealed as the actual foundation of human behavior. The modernists' systematic fragmentation of the literary forms that the 19th century had produced as the specific expression of the coherent self that the war had demonstrated was a fiction. In this cultural context, the drug was not merely a recreational choice. It was the specific gesture of the transgressive self-definition that the bohemian culture required. The person who used heroin in Montparnasse in 1924 was performing the specific act of the person who had decided that the bourgeois prohibitions, the normal, respectable, conventional restraints on behavior, were not binding on the person who had rejected the civilization that had produced them. This cultural logic was as seductive as it was dangerous, and it was particularly dangerous because the specific cultural world that it produced in 1920s, Paris, was genuinely brilliant. The people who were making the art and writing the books and playing the music and conducting the intellectual experiments that defined the period were, many of them, the same people who were using the drugs that the specific milieu made available. And the drugs appeared, to the person experiencing them, and to the observers of the person experiencing them, to be compatible with the brilliance, or even, in some formulations, to be contributing to it. The specific relationship between the drug use and the creative work was the relationship that the 19th century Romantic tradition had already established as a framework. The idea that the altered consciousness produced by the drug was the specific door to the creative insight that the sober consciousness couldn't access. De Quincey's Confessions of an English opium eater had established the literary precedent. Baudelaire and the Club des Hachichens had established the French aesthetic tradition. The 1920s, Paris drug culture was inheriting this framework and applying it to the specific substances of its moment. The specific social spaces of the heroin use were the spaces of the 1920s Paris social world, the cafes and the cabarets and the private apartments and the specific gatherings of the bohemian community. The heroin was not exclusively the drug of the street addict in the specific social context of 1920s Paris. It was present in the salon and the studio and the literary gathering, as well as in the more desperate circumstances of the person who had passed through the cultural experimentation into the specific dependency that the opioid produces. The American expatriates who had come to Paris were encountering heroin in the specific context of the European drug culture that prohibition had partly generated. The 18th Amendment had eliminated the legal drinking culture of the United States and had pushed the American social response to alter consciousness toward the underground, where the specific proximity of the underground drinking culture to the drug culture that shared its spaces created the conditions for the Americans' encounter with European drug habits. The specific geography of the drug use in 1920s. Paris followed the geography of the bohemian community. Montparnasse, the specific left bank neighborhood that had replaced Montmartre as the center of the artistic community in the early 20th century, was the primary location. The cafes of the Carrefour Vavin, the Select, the Dôme, the Rotonde, the Coupole, were the specific social spaces where the artistic community gathered and where the social networks that included the drug supply were most densely present. Montmartre retained its specific drug culture character. The specific combination of the cabarets and the criminal networks that had established themselves in the neighborhood in the pre-war period continued to operate in the 1920s, with the specific addition of the new substances that the post-war supply, disruption, and reorganization had introduced. The Pigalle district, the specific area between Montmartre and the Grands boulevards that the entertainment industry and its associated criminal economy had colonized, was the specific geographic location of the heroin trade's more commercial and less bohemian manifestation. The women of 1920s Paris had a specific complicated relationship with the drug culture, the specific gender dynamics of the bohemian community, the liberation of the garçon, the short-haired, cigarette-smoking, independent woman of the 1920s who was performing the specific rejection of the pre-war feminine ideal, included the specific freedom to participate in the drug culture as an equal partner rather than as the protected, sheltered female of the bourgeois tradition. The female artist, the female writer, the female musician of 1920s Paris was operating in the specific social environment of the bohemian community that had, at least in principle, rejected the gender distinctions of the bourgeois world. In practice, the gender distinctions persisted in specific forms. The woman's drug use was more morally condemned than the man's. The woman's addiction was more likely to be understood as a personal failure than as an artistic experiment. The woman's recovery from the drug was less likely to be supported by the institutional structures that the male addict could access. Chapter 3. The Supply Chain. How heroin actually got to Paris, and who was making money. The heroin didn't just appear. The specific supply chain that delivered the heroin to the cafes of Montparnasse and the cabarets of Montmartre was the specific commercial infrastructure of the international drug trade that the 1920s was in the process of constructing, not yet the fully developed criminal networks of the later decades, but the specific transitional form of the trade that the combination of the pharmaceutical industry's legal production, the criminal network's illegal distribution, and the international regulations' inconsistent application had produced. The raw material, the opium, came primarily from the East. The Ottoman Empire, the Persian territories, the Indian subcontinent, the Chinese production, the opium-producing regions of the world had been supplying the European and American markets through the pre-war pharmaceutical trade, and the disruption of the war had not eliminated the supply, but had transformed the distribution networks. The morphine and heroin processing happened primarily in Europe. The legitimate pharmaceutical factories of Germany, Switzerland, and France were producing the opiates for the medical market, and the specific surplus production that the military demand had stimulated and the peacetime contraction had not reduced was finding its way through the channels that the criminal networks were developing for exactly this purpose. The specific role of the German pharmaceutical industry in the 1920s heroin trade was the role of the large legitimate manufacturer, whose production could not be entirely monitored by the specific international regulatory framework that the League of Nations Drug Control Commission was attempting to establish. The agreements that the international community was developing for the control of the opiate trade were agreements that the producing nations could sign, and that the specific diversion of the legal production to the illegal market could undermine from inside the legitimate system. The Turkish connection was the specific supply chain element that the post-war disruption had created, and that the 1920s Paris heroin trade most directly depended on. The collapse of the Ottoman Empire had produced the specific political and economic disruption of the Anatolian opium production and processing that the established trade networks had previously managed, and the new criminal networks were developing in the specific space that the disruption had created. The Corsican connection was the specific French element of the supply chain. The specific criminal networks of the Corsican organized crime families that had established themselves in Marseille and in Paris, and that were developing the infrastructure for the drug trade alongside their existing criminal enterprises. The Corsicans' specific role in the Marseille port and their connections to the North African trade routes gave them the specific positioning in the supply chain that the subsequent decades would formalize into the French connection that the mid-20th century heroin trade would be named for. The Chinese community in Paris was a specific population that the early drug trade mythology associated with the opium traffic, and the association was not entirely without basis. The established opium smoking culture of certain Chinese communities in Paris was the specific form of the drug use that the French press found most visually dramatic and most appropriate for the specific Orientalist framing that the drug panic of the period regularly deployed. The Chinese opium den was the specific image that the newspaper coverage favored, and the specific reality was considerably more complex and less monolithic than the image implied. The street-level distribution in Paris was the distribution of the small-scale dealer, the person who occupied the specific interface between the wholesale supply and the individual user, who knew the customers and knew the neighborhoods and knew the specific social networks through which the drug moved in the specific milieu of the bohemian community and the entertainment industry and the criminal economy that overlapped in the specific geography of the Montmartre and Montparnasse neighborhoods. The price at the street level reflected the specific supply chain's economics, the margins accumulated at each level of the distribution, from the production through the import, through the wholesale distribution, through the retail, to the individual user. The specific price in 1920s. Paris was the price that made the drug accessible to the bohemian community, not cheap enough for the absolute destitute, but within the range of the working artist's income, or the modest inheritance, or the specific supplementary income that the various participants in the bohemian economy were managing. The adulteration of the supply was the specific quality control problem of the illegal market. The specific practice of cutting the heroin with the various diluents that increase the volume and reduce the purity, transferring margin from the user to the distributor, while reducing the predictability of the dose that the individual user was actually consuming. The specific danger of the adulterated supply was the danger of the dose that was either too weak, the user who increased the dose to compensate and then encountered the purer supply, or too strong, the user who had calibrated to the cut product and then encountered the uncut batch. The pharmacist was the specific legitimate commercial actor in the heroin supply chain who occupied the boundary between the legal and the illegal. The French pharmaceutical regulation of the early 1920s still permitted the sale of heroin and morphine through the pharmacy system, with the prescription requirements that were in the process of being tightened. The pharmacist who sold the prescription opiates with the specific looseness of prescription verification that the transitional regulatory environment permitted was the specific actor whose commercial decision contributed to the drug supply that the bohemian community and the broader population of addicted users was accessing. Chapter 4. Famous users, the artists and writers, and the specific ways the drug entered their lives. Jean Cocteau had a problem. Jean Cocteau, the French poet, novelist, playwright, filmmaker, visual artist, and generally exhausting genius of 20th century French culture, was one of the most prominent figures in 1920s Paris, and he was also one of the most honestly documented heroin users of the period. His 1930 memoir, Opium, The Diary of a Cure, is the specific document that the period's drug culture produced in its most self-aware form. The account of the addiction and the cure written from inside the experience, with the specific combination of the aesthete's eye for the drug's seductions and the recovering addict's honest accounting of its costs. Cocteau had been introduced to opium in the early 1920s, the specific introduction that the cultural context of Montparnasse made available, through the networks of the artistic community that included the specific individuals whose own use created the social environment in which the drug was present. His relationship with the drug was the relationship of the person who had found in the opioid's specific effect the specific relief from the anxiety and the overactivity of his own mind that the opium temporarily provided. The specific effects of the opioid that Cocteau described in his diary, the warmth, the relaxation, the specific cessation of the mental activity that the drug produced, were the effects that the person who experienced them found genuinely attractive in ways that the non-user struggles to fully understand from the outside. The opioid's effect is not simply euphoria in the way that the word is often used. It is the specific comprehensive comfort of the body and mind that the person who is chronically anxious or in pain finds profoundly appealing precisely because it addresses the specific discomfort that their normal state involves. Cocteau's cure, the specific detoxification from the opium that he underwent at the clinic of Dr. Thurston in 1929, produced the diary that he published in 1930. The diary is both the honest account of the withdrawal and the specific aesthetic artifact of the person who is simultaneously undergoing the experience and observing himself undergoing it, with the writer's specific capacity for the simultaneous experience and documentation that the literary sensibility produces. The Cure produced Cocteau's most honest work, which is a specific observation about the drug's relationship to the creative output that the mythology of the drug-using artist tends to invert. The mythology says the drug enabled the creativity, and in some cases and some periods, it may have contributed to it. But in Cocteau's specific case, the most illuminating work came from the experience of the recovery rather than from the experience of the drug itself. Francis Picabia, the Dada artist, whose specific relationship with the transgressive was both artistic and personal, was another documented heroin user of the period, whose specific involvement with the drug was part of the broader pattern of the Dada movement's systematic exploration of the limits of conventional behavior. Picabia's drug use was the drug use of the person who had decided that the limits of convention were the limits of mediocrity, and who was prepared to explore whatever lay beyond them. The Americans who had come to Paris were encountering the drug culture in the specific context of their expatriate experience. The specific social environment of the American community in Paris, which was simultaneously the cultural vanguard and the specific social world of the displaced, the people who had left the United States for reasons that combined the cultural ambition with the personal flight, and who found in Paris both the intellectual stimulation they had sought and the specific vulnerabilities that the displacement had created. Hemingway wrote about the drug culture of 1920s Paris, with the specific obliqueness of the person who was simultaneously documenting the world he was inhabiting and protecting his own position within it. The Sun Also Rises, published in 1926, is the specific novel that the Lost Generation mythology has made canonical, and the specific careful omissions of its portrayal of the 1920s Paris bohemian world, the things that are present in the milieu but not in the text, include the specific drug culture that the characters inhabit without the novels directly addressing, the jazz musicians who had come to Paris, the Black American musicians who found in Paris the specific freedom from the racial segregation of the United States that made the city attractive beyond its musical culture. We're encountering the drug culture in the specific context of the entertainment industry that the Paris jazz scene represented. The correlation between the jazz culture and the drug culture in 1920s Paris was the correlation of two communities that occupied the same social spaces and shared the specific social networks that the Montmartre nightlife created. Chapter 5. The Consequences. What addiction actually looked like. In 1920s, Paris, the romantic version of the 1920s. Paris drug scene stops at the first injection, or rather it stops at the specific moment before the trajectory of the opioid addiction becomes visible, the moment of the initial encounter, the aesthetic experiment, the specific transgressive gesture of the bohemian experimenter who is trying the drug in the same spirit of artistic exploration that they are trying everything else that the 1920s Paris milieu makes available. The romantic version doesn't linger on what comes next. What comes next is the specific pharmacology of the opioid, which does not adjust its operation for the artistic intentions of the person taking it. The opioid receptor system that the heroin activates, the specific endogenous system that the brain uses to regulate pain, pleasure, and the various motivational states that the opioid hijacks, does not make distinctions between the bohemian artist's use and anyone else's use. The neural adaptation that the repeated stimulation of the opioid receptor system produces, the specific downregulation of the receptor density and sensitivity that the chronic exposure creates, is the specific biological process that produces the tolerance and the dependence that define the addicted state. The tolerance meant that the dose that had produced the specific effect that the initial user had found attractive no longer produced the same effect after the weeks and months of regular use. The body's adaptation to the drug's presence meant that the same dose produced a smaller response, requiring the larger dose to produce the equivalent effect. The larger dose required the larger expenditure, requiring the more frequent and more desperate engagement with the supply chain, requiring the more comprehensive reorganization of the user's life around the drug's requirements. The dependence meant that the cessation of the drug, the period without the heroin that the withdrawal produced, was the period of the specific physical and psychological distress that the opioid withdrawal creates. The nausea and vomiting, the muscle cramps and the sweating, the insomnia and the anxiety, the specific misery of the opioid withdrawal syndrome were the specific experiences that the person who had become physically dependent on heroin encountered when the supply was disrupted or the decision to stop was made. The withdrawal was not fatal in the way that the alcohol withdrawal can be fatal. The opioid withdrawal is not the withdrawal syndrome that produces the seizures and the delirium that the alcohol withdrawal can generate, but it was genuinely miserable in ways that the person experiencing it found overwhelming and the specific relief of the resumption of the drug, the specific immediate resolution of the withdrawal distress that the next dose provided, was the specific pharmacological reinforcement that made the continued use feel both necessary and rational from inside the addicted state. The specific trajectory of the heroin addiction in 1920s. Paris was the trajectory that the opioid pharmacology predicted, the progression from the experimental use to the regular use, to the compulsive use, to the specific state of the person whose entire life had been reorganized around the drug's requirements. The progression happened at different speeds for different individuals, reflecting the specific genetic and psychological vulnerabilities that the addiction research has subsequently identified as risk factors, but it happened. And the Montparnasse and Montmartre of the mid-1920s contained a significant number of people in various stages of this progression. The financial consequences were the specific first social consequence of the addiction's progression. The artist who had been managing on the small income of the struggling creative, the part-time work, and the occasional sale, and the specific creative accounting of the bohemian economy, found the drug's requirement for increasing expenditure colliding with the income that the bohemian lifestyle had never been adequate to address. The financial crisis of the addict was the specific intersection of the escalating cost and the diminishing capacity that the addiction produced. The drug's requirement for money competing with the drug's impairment of the ability to earn it. The social consequences were the specific erosion of the relationships that the addiction's progressive demands created. The person whose reliability had been the foundation of their relationships, professional, romantic, personal, found the reliability eroding as the drug's requirements took precedence. The missed appointments, the broken commitments, the specific unpredictability of the person whose behavior was being organized by the drug's demands rather than by the social obligations that the relationships required. These were the specific mechanisms through which the addiction's social consequences accumulated. The health consequences were the specific medical reality that the 1920s Parisian medical system was beginning to see in the specific pattern of the patients who were presenting to the hospitals and the clinics with the conditions that the heroin use was producing. The infections from the specific injection practice of the period, the shared needles, the non-sterile injection technique, the specific biological consequences of the intravenous drug use that the 1920s was not yet fully equipped to prevent or treat, were the specific medical presentations that the Parisian hospitals were encountering with increasing frequency. Chapter 6. The Police. How the French authorities responded to the drug crisis and why the EI response was inadequate. In specific, interesting ways. The Sûreté had a drug problem, not the drug problem of the Sûreté's officers, though that existed too in the specific, unremarkable way that any large law enforcement agency operating in a drug-saturated environment produces its share of compromised personnel. The Sûreté had the drug problem of the institution that had been given responsibility for managing a phenomenon that was growing faster than its capacity to manage it, with the specific tools of the enforcement regime that the pre-war regulatory system had not designed for the scale and the organization of the post-war drug trade. The French drug enforcement apparatus of the early 1920s was the apparatus of the transitional moment, the specific institutional configuration of the law enforcement system that had inherited the pre-war approach to the drug question and was in the process of developing the more comprehensive response that the post-war situation required. The pre-war approach had been the approach of the pharmaceutical regulation, the control of the drug supply through the pharmacy system, the prescription requirement, the specific monitoring of the legitimate commercial chain, that the legitimate commercial chain still represented the primary distribution system. The post-war approach required the criminal enforcement apparatus, the detectives, the informants, the surveillance operations, the specific tools of the law enforcement agency dealing with the criminal organization rather than the errant pharmacist, the brigade mondaine, the morality police of the Paris prefecture, the specific unit of the French law enforcement apparatus that had responsibility for the vice offenses, including the drug offenses, was the specific institutional actor whose operations the historical record of the 1920s drug enforcement documents. The brigade's approach to the drug problem was the approach of the vice enforcement unit that had developed its operational methods around the prostitution and the gambling, and the specific commercial vice activities that the morality police had managed before the drug trade became a significant part of the portfolio. The specific operational challenge of the drug enforcement was the challenge of the invisible transaction, the commercial exchange that left fewer visible traces in the public space than the prostitution or the gambling that happened in private apartments and cafe back rooms and the specific social spaces of the bohemian community, rather than in the street-level venues that the morality police had learned to monitor. The drug deal was the transaction between the acquaintances, embedded in the social network of the bohemian community, conducted through the trust relationships of the specific milieu, rather than through the anonymous commercial exchange that the enforcement agency's existing tools were designed to identify. The informant was the specific tool that the drug enforcement relied on most heavily, the person inside the community who could provide the specific network-based intelligence that the external observation could not generate. The informant's reliability was the specific operational challenge of the enforcement apparatus. The person who was willing to inform on the drug trade was likely to be the person whose own involvement in the drug trade gave them the access that made their information useful. And the specific reliability of the information that the involved informant provided was the reliability of the person whose interests were not aligned with the law enforcement agency's interests in a simple, trustworthy way. The corruption of the enforcement apparatus was the specific institutional consequence of the drug trade's financial resources, meeting the specific vulnerabilities of the law enforcement personnel, who were its primary contact point. The brigade mondaine officer, whose salary was the salary of the Third Republic's civil servant, modest, stable, inadequate to the specific temptations that the drug trade's financial margins created, was the officer whose specific vulnerability to the corruption that the trade's participants found useful to cultivate was the vulnerability of the person whose legitimate income was measurably less than what the illegitimate alternative offered. The corruption was not universal. The historical record does not support the picture of the wholesale corruption of the French drug enforcement in the 1920s, but it was present in the specific, documented form of the officers whose performance of their enforcement duties was modified by the specific financial arrangements that the drug trade's participants found useful to maintain. The officer who knew which raids to conduct and which to delay, who provided the advance warning that the specific operations timing required, who managed the evidence in the specific ways that the prosecution required to fail. These were the specific operational consequences of the corruption that the drug trade's financial resources enabled. The legal framework that the drug enforcement was operating within was the legal framework of the transitional moment. The French law of July 12, 1916, the Loi du 12 juillet 1906, was the specific legislation that had first criminalized the trafficking of the opiates and cocaine in France, the specific legislative response to the pre-war drug problem that the war's disruptions had not made easier to enforce. The 1916 law was the legal foundation that the 1920s enforcement was working with, a foundation whose specific provisions were designed for the pre-war problem and whose adequacy for the post-war situation was being tested by the specific scale and organization of the drug trade that the 1920s had produced. The international dimension of the drug control effort was the dimension that the specific bilateral French enforcement could not address unilaterally. The opium that arrived from Turkey or Persia, the morphine base that was processed in the clandestine laboratories of the specific European locations that the criminal networks had established, the heroin that crossed the specific borders that the French customs enforcement was trying to monitor. These were the elements of the supply chain that the domestic enforcement could only address at its French end, and the specific inadequacy of the domestic enforcement at the domestic end was compounded by the specific inadequacy of the international cooperation that the League of Nations Drug Control Commission was attempting to develop, and that the individual nations were implementing with varying degrees of seriousness. The periodic crackdown was the specific operational mode of the 1920s French drug enforcement, the concentrated operation against the specific venue or the specific network that the accumulated intelligence had identified, the arrest and the prosecution, and the specific public visibility of the enforcement action that the press coverage provided, followed by the specific resumption of the trade through the alternative channels that the criminal network's resilience had maintained. The crackdown demonstrated that the enforcement was happening. It did not demonstrate that the enforcement was working in the specific sense of reducing the scale of the drug trade or the availability of the drug to the population using it. Chapter 7. The Press. How the French newspapers covered the drug crisis, and what their coverage reveals about the period's anxieties. The headlines were spectacular. Not spectacular in the way of the measured, evidenced, contextualized reporting that the journalism school recommends. Spectacular in the way of the newspaper coverage that has identified the specific story whose combination of the exotic, the dangerous, and the morally alarming produces the readership that the commercial newspaper requires. The heroin craze of 1920s Paris was, for the French press of the period, the specific story that combined all of these elements with the additional dimension of the specific anxiety about national decline that the post-war French political culture was producing at considerable volume. Le Matin, Le Figaro, Le Petit Parisien, the major French newspapers of the period, covered the drug question with the specific combination of the moral alarm and the narrative fascination that the tabloid tradition produces when it encounters a subject whose horror and whose appeal are inseparable. The drug den was the specific image that the coverage favored, the opium den of the Orientalist imagination, the filthy basement of the specific criminal geography that the newspaper could describe in the specific vivid detail of the place that the respectable reader would never visit, but could imagine visiting through the newspaper's account. The Orientalism of the coverage was the specific, consistent framework through which the French press understood the drug crisis, the framework that located the origin of the problem in the East, in the specific foreign sources that the racial logic of the colonial imagination identified as the natural origin of the corrupting influence that was attacking the French national body. The Chinese opium den, the Turkish hashish merchant, the specifically foreign dimension of the drug supply. These were the images that the coverage favored because they allowed the specific comfort of the problem being external in origin, arriving from outside, rather than emerging from the specific conditions of the French post-war society that had made the demand possible. The coverage of the famous users was the coverage that the specific intersection of the celebrity culture and the drug crisis produced. The scandal of the known artist or the prominent social figure whose involvement with the drug trade the newspaper had documented. The specific tension between the celebrity journalism's investment in the glamour of the Montparnasse artistic community and the moral journalism's investment in the scandal of the same community's drug use was the specific tension that the 1920s press managed by covering both simultaneously. The same newspaper that published the admiring profile of the artist would publish the scandalized account of the arrest for drug possession. The coverage of the female addict was the specific gender dimension of the press's drug reporting that reveals the period's specific anxieties about the changing role of women in post-war French society. The woman who had used heroin was the woman who had failed the specific expectations that the French culture maintained for the female. The expectations of the respectable, the domestic, the appropriately feminine that the garçon of the 1920s was already challenging by her existence. The female addict was the garçon's shadow, the specific dark consequence of the feminine liberation that the conservative press had been predicting, and that the drug coverage allowed it to document. The coverage generated the specific self-reinforcing cycle of the moral panic. The newspaper report of the drug crisis, producing the public anxiety that produced the demand for the official response, that produced the enforcement action, that produced the arrests, that produced the newspaper reports. The moral panic of the 1920s French drug coverage was not the simple manipulation of the population by the cynical press. The drug crisis was real, the harm was genuine, and the coverage's alarm had a basis in the documented facts. But the coverage's framing, the orientalist, the gendered, the sensationalist, shaped the public understanding of the crisis in the specific ways that the framing of the news story always shapes understanding, directing attention toward the visible and the dramatic, and away from the structural and the systemic. The specific newspapers that published the most extensive drug coverage were the newspapers of the popular press. The high circulation, commercially oriented papers that had identified the drug story as the specific type of content that their readership consumed with the specific, morally titillated engagement that the scandalous story produces. The quality press, the specifically literary and intellectual publications that the Parisian cultural world produced in considerable quantity in the 1920s, engaged with the drug question in the different register of the cultural and the aesthetic, producing the essays and the criticism and the literary treatments that engaged with the drug as the cultural phenomenon, rather than the criminal emergency. Chapter 8. The Women. The specific, complicated experience of female drug users. In 1920s Paris, the woman in the cafe is not the woman in the newspaper. The specific woman who was using heroin in 1920s. Paris, the actual person in the actual social situation, navigating the actual conditions of the drug use in the actual world of the bohemian community, was not the specific woman who appeared in the newspaper coverage of the drug crisis. The newspaper's female addict was the specific construction of the moral journalism. The fallen woman, the corrupted garçon, the respectable woman seduced by the foreign influence, who served the specific narrative purposes of the coverage. The actual women who were using heroin in 1920s. Paris were more varied, more complicated, and more interesting than the newspaper's construction allowed. The specific women of the artistic community, the painters, the writers, the musicians, the various participants in the specific creative world of Montparnasse, who used heroin were using it in the same social contexts as the men, the cafes, the studios, the private apartments, the specific gatherings of the bohemian community that the social world of the artistic milieu organized. They were encountering the drug through the same social networks, making the same initial decisions about experimentation, and experiencing the same pharmacological consequences that the opioid produced, regardless of the gender of the user. The specific difference was the social consequence. The woman whose heroin use became known in the bohemian community occupied a different social position from the man whose heroin use became known in the same community. The man's use could be framed by himself and by the community as the artistic experiment, the transgressive gesture, the specific exploration of the limits of experience that the bohemian tradition valued. The woman's use was more likely to be framed as the personal failure, the moral collapse, the specific evidence of the woman's inability to manage her own freedom, the specific gender double standard of the community that had claimed to reject the bourgeois gender distinctions and that reproduced them in the specific practical assessment of the identical behavior by the differently gendered person. The specific women whose drug used the historical record documents include the figures whose involvement with the heroin of 1920s Paris has been documented in the biographies and memoirs and letters that the period produced. Nina Hamnet, the British painter who became one of the central figures of the Montparnasse artistic community and whose memoir Laughing Torso is one of the most vivid first-hand accounts of the milieu, was deeply embedded in the social world that the drug culture inhabited, and her account of the period documents the specific casual presence of the drug use in the community's social life, with the matter-of-fact directness of the person describing the normal rather than the exceptional. The model, the specific figure of the woman who occupied the specific, economically precarious position of the artist's model in the 1920s Paris artistic community, was the figure whose specific economic vulnerability and whose specific social proximity to the artistic milieu placed her in the specific situation of the person most exposed to the drug culture's appeal and least protected from its consequences. The model's income was irregular. The model's social position was the position of the person who existed in the artistic community's social world without the specific social protection of the artist's professional identity. The model's encounter with the drug culture was the encounter of the person whose economic desperation and social exposure made the drug's temporary relief particularly attractive and its consequences particularly difficult to manage. The specific institutional response to the female addict was the response of the French medical and social welfare system that had not yet developed the specific services that the female addict's situation required. The hospital that admitted the female addict admitted her to the ward, whose design and operation reflected the specific assumptions of the period's medical understanding of the addiction as the moral failure rather than the medical condition. The assumption that meant the treatment was the treatment of the moral failure rather than the pharmacological condition, and that the woman who had failed morally required a different response from the man who had made the same pharmacological error. The recovery path for the woman who had become dependent on heroin was the recovery path of the person operating without the specific resources that the male addict could more readily access, the professional networks that might support the male addict's recovery, the connections that allowed the continued professional engagement during the recovery, the specific social capital that the male artistic career had accumulated, were less available to the woman whose professional identity in the bohemian community was less firmly established and less robustly supported by the institutional structures of the artistic world. Chapter 9. The End of the Party. How the 1920s. Drug culture collapsed, and what replaced it. The party ended in stages, not all at once. The specific cultural moment of 1920s. Paris did not conclude on a single date or with a single event. The decade's specific, extraordinary configuration of the economic conditions and the cultural energy and the social freedom that had made it what it was dissolved through the accumulation of the specific events and the specific pressures that the end of the 1920s produced. The drug culture that had been embedded in that configuration dissolved with it, transformed by the changing conditions into the different, darker, less culturally prominent form that the subsequent decades would produce. The first stage of the ending was the financial. The Wall Street crash of October 1929 and the Great Depression that followed it transformed the economic conditions of the expatriate community with the specific, immediate force of the financial crisis that eliminated the private incomes and the currency advantages that had made the American presence in Paris economically possible. The Americans who had been living in Paris on the specific exchange rate advantages that made the dollar's purchasing power in France extraordinary in the 1920s found the exchange rate advantages disappearing as the Depression transformed the financial landscape. The remittances from home stopped or diminished. The private incomes that had supported the specific bohemian lifestyle of the left bank were reduced or eliminated. The Americans left. Not all at once, and not all of them, but the specific critical mass of the American expatriate community that had given the 1920s Paris. Its distinctive character was substantially reduced by the early 1930s, and the specific milieu that the community had created changed in character with its departure. The cafes of Montparnasse lost their specific clientele. The bookshops and the small publishing houses that had depended on the expatriate community's patronage contracted. The specific, extraordinary cultural ecosystem of the lost generations, Paris was over. The French drug regulation was the second pressure. The international drug control effort that the League of Nations was developing through the 1920s was producing the specific, progressive tightening of the regulatory framework that the French government was implementing in response to both the domestic drug crisis and the international obligations that the drug control treaties imposed. The amendments to the French drug law through the late 1920s and early 1930s were the specific legislative accumulation of the regulatory response that the drug crisis had demanded. Tighter prescription requirements, more comprehensive criminal penalties for trafficking, the specific expansion of the enforcement apparatus that the scale of the problem required. The tightening of the regulation did not eliminate the drug trade. The subsequent history of drug enforcement in France and everywhere else demonstrates the specific, consistent failure of the regulatory response to eliminate the supply of the substance whose demand is sufficiently powerful. But it did transform the character of the drug trade, pushing it further underground, reducing its accessibility to the casual user while maintaining it for the committed addict, changing the specific social character of the drug use from the semi-open cultural experiment of the early 1920s to the more covert, more stigmatized, more criminally embedded activity of the later decade, The rise of the political crisis was the third pressure. The specific political deterioration of the 1930s, the Depression's economic consequences producing the political extremism that the democratic institutions of Europe were struggling to contain, the rise of fascism in Germany and Italy, the specific growing sense of the catastrophe approaching that the political events of the early and mid-1930s were generating, transformed the cultural and intellectual climate of Paris in ways that made the specific aesthetic experimentation of the 1920s feel increasingly irrelevant. The drug culture of the 1920s had been embedded in the specific cultural moment of the interwar optimism. The specific post-war belief that the catastrophe was behind and the future was open, as the 1930s demonstrated that the catastrophe was not behind, but ahead. The specific cultural conditions that had made the drug use a gesture of liberation rather than a symptom of despair shifted, and the drug use in the cultural milieu shifted with them, becoming less the bohemian experiment and more the specific refuge of the person who was watching the world deteriorate and had found in the opioid the specific temporary relief from the specific permanent anxiety that the watching produced. The writers and artists who had been in Paris in the 1920s and who remained into the 1930s produced a different body of work that reflected the changed conditions, the growing darkness, the specific awareness that the extraordinary moment was over and the ordinary catastrophe was beginning. The drug culture that had been part of the 1920s moment became part of the 1930s darkness. Less celebrated, less aestheticized, more hidden, more desperate. The specific end of the 1920s. Paris drug craze was not a clean ending. The heroin did not disappear from Paris. The addiction of the specific individuals who had become dependent on it in the 1920s did not resolve with the decade's ending. The criminal networks that had established themselves in the drug trade did not dissolve because the cultural moment that had made the drug fashionable had passed. What ended was the specific cultural visibility of the drug use, the specific moment when heroin had been part of the aesthetic landscape of Montparnasse, rather than simply part of its criminal geography. Chapter 10. The Doctors. How the French medical establishment understood addiction and why their understanding shaped the treatment, or its absence. The doctor looking at the heroin addict in 1920s. Paris was looking through a set of conceptual lenses that the history of medicine had provided, and that the subsequent history of addiction medicine would comprehensively revise. The lenses were the lenses of the moral and the medical frameworks that the 19th century had bequeathed to the 20th. Frameworks that had not yet resolved the fundamental question of whether the addiction was a disease or a vice, whether the addicted person was a patient or a criminal, whether the appropriate institutional response was the clinic or the prison or some combination of the two that the French system was in the process of improvising. The moral framework had the longer history and the deeper cultural roots. The opium eater of De Quincey's 1821 Confession, the morphine addict of the late 19th century medical literature, the heroin user of the 1920s press reports. These were figures whose relationship with the drug was understood in the dominant cultural framework of the period as a failure of the will. The specific Cartesian tradition of the French philosophical culture, the tradition that located the self in the rational mind's capacity to govern the body's impulses, produced the specific, culturally resonant understanding of the addiction as the failure of the rational self to maintain the governance of the body that the human dignity required. The medical framework was newer and more contested. The late 19th century had produced the first systematic medical thinking about addiction as a condition that had physiological dimensions. The recognition that the person who had become habituated to the opioid was experiencing something more than the simple moral weakness of the person who had decided to continue taking the drug, despite knowing its consequences. The specific, observable phenomena of the tolerance and the withdrawal. The body's changed relationship with the drug that the habituation produced were phenomena that the medical observation had documented and that the moral framework alone could not fully explain. The French medical establishment of the 1920s had produced a series of physicians whose specific clinical experience with the addicted patients of the post-war period was generating a body of medical knowledge about addiction that the subsequent decades would build on, and that the 1920s was in the process of accumulating. The specific physicians who had established the treatment facilities for the addicted, the private clinics and the hospital wards that were beginning to develop the specific clinical approach to detoxification and post-detoxification support that the medical treatment of addiction required, were the physicians whose clinical experience was generating the knowledge about what worked and what didn't that the medical tradition was slowly accumulating. The specific treatment that the 1920s clinic offered the heroin addict was the treatment of the detoxification. The managed withdrawal from the drug, the specific clinical management of the withdrawal syndrome that the opioid dependency produced, the supportive care that addressed the physical symptoms of the withdrawal in the specific institutional environment of the clinical facility. The detoxification was the treatment that the medical framework could offer with some confidence. The specific physiological process of the body's readjustment to the drug's absence was a process that the medical management could support, and whose specific symptoms the clinical tools of the period could partially address. What the 1920s clinic could not offer was the treatment of the addiction beyond the detoxification, the specific sustained support for the post-detoxification person that the recovery from the opioid dependency required, the pharmacological understanding of the addiction's post-acute phase, the specific period after the acute withdrawal had resolved, when the addicted person faced the specific challenges of the craving and the conditioned response, and the vulnerability to the relapse that the subsequent addiction medicine has identified as the dominant clinical challenges of the recovery, was not the understanding that the 1920s medical community possessed. The treatment stopped where the acute medical phase ended, and the person who had been detoxified was returned to the social environment from which they had come, without the specific support for the ongoing recovery that the addiction's post-acute phase required. The private clinic was the specific institutional context in which the treatment of the famous and the wealthy addict occurred, the specific socially segregated context that the class structure of the French medical system produced. Jean Cocteau's cure at Dr. Thurston's clinic was the cure of the person who had the social connections and the financial resources to access the specific private medical facility that offered the most comfortable and the most medically competent version of the treatment that the period could provide. The person who did not have Cocteau's social connections and financial resources, the working artist, the model, the casual laborer of the bohemian economy, accessed a different level of care in the public hospital ward, whose conditions reflected the specific stigmatized status of the addicted patient in the public medical system. The stigma was the specific, consistent feature of the medical treatment of the addiction in 1920s Paris. The stigma that attached to the addicted patient in both the medical and the social context that shaped the quality and the character of the treatment that the medical system offered. and that the addicted person navigated in the specific, practically consequential ways that the stigma of a medical condition shapes the patient's engagement with the care system. The person who feared the stigma of the addiction diagnosis postponed the treatment. The person who experienced the stigma in the treatment environment was less likely to remain engaged with the care. The stigma was not merely the moral judgment of the society on the addicted person. It was the specific, practical barrier to the treatment that the addicted person's recovery required. The specific pharmacological tools that the 1920s medical system had available for the treatment of the opioid withdrawal were the tools of a medical tradition that had not yet developed the specific agents that the subsequent decades of addiction medicine would produce. The opioid agonist treatments, the methadone maintenance, and the buprenorphine approaches that the late 20th century addiction medicine would develop were not available. The specific management of the withdrawal syndrome relied on the supportive care, the symptomatic treatment of the individual withdrawal symptoms, the sedatives for the insomnia, the antispasmodics for the cramping, the oral hydration for the nausea and vomiting, rather than on the specific pharmacological approaches that later medicine would develop for the management of the opioid withdrawal. The physician who was treating the heroin addict in 1920s. Paris was treating a patient whose condition the medical framework of the period understood incompletely with the tools that the period's pharmacology made available in the institutional context that the stigma in the class structure of the French medical system had shaped. The treatment was better than nothing. It was considerably less effective than what the subsequent century of addiction medicine would produce. The gap between the two was measured in the specific human cost of the people who were treated inadequately and relapsed, and of the people who did not seek treatment because the treatment that was available was not adequate to the task that the addiction required. Chapter 11. The International Dimension, the League of Nations, the Opium Conferences, and the specific failure of collective action. The problem was always larger than Paris. The specific local manifestation of the heroin crisis in the cafes and the clinics and the police precincts of 1920s Paris was the local expression of the international problem, the problem of the global opium trade, whose production happened in the East, and whose processing happened in Europe, and whose distribution happened across the specific porous borders of the post-war international order that the League of Nations was attempting to govern without the specific effective instruments of enforcement that the governing required. The League of Nations had established its advisory committee on traffic in opium and other dangerous drugs in 1920. The specific international body, whose mandate was the development of the international regulatory framework for the opiate trade that the individual nations could not develop unilaterally and that the pre-war international order had not produced. The committee was the institutional expression of the specific post-war optimism about the capacity of the international institutions to solve the problems that the individual states could not solve alone. The optimism that the League itself embodied and that the subsequent decades of the 20th century would comprehensively test. The International Opium Convention of 1912, signed at The Hague, predating the League by nearly a decade, had been the first significant multilateral attempt to coordinate the control of the opiate trade, requiring the signatory nations to take measures to limit the manufacture and distribution of morphine, heroin, and cocaine to legitimate medical and scientific purposes. The convention had been incorporated into the post-war peace treaties as an obligation of the signatory powers, and the League's Drug Control Committee was the institutional mechanism through which the convention's implementation was to be monitored and developed. The specific limitation of the international drug control framework in the 1920s was the limitation of any international regulatory regime whose enforcement depends on the specific compliance of the individual sovereign states, whose interests do not always align with the collective interest that the regime is designed to protect. The producing states, the countries whose territories grew the opium poppy and whose farmers depended on the crop, had the specific economic interest in maintaining the production that the regulatory framework was attempting to limit. The processing states, the European pharmaceutical manufacturing nations whose factories converted the raw opium into the morphine and heroin that the medical market and the criminal market both demanded, had the specific commercial interest in maintaining the production capacity that the regulatory framework was attempting to control. The 1924 to 1925 Geneva Opium Conferences were the specific international events of the 1920s drug control effort. The two conferences that the League convened in November 1924, and that attempted to develop the more comprehensive international agreement on the control of the opiate trade that the 1912 convention had not produced. The first conference was the Conference of the Opium-Producing Nations, the specific gathering of the countries whose territories produced the raw material of the drug trade, and whose participation in the control of the production was the necessary foundation of any effective international regulation. The United States, not a member of the League, but a significant force in the international drug control effort through the specific moral authority of its own domestic regulation and the diplomatic pressure that the American delegation brought to the conferences, walked out of the Geneva conferences in frustration at the producing nations' refusal to commit to the production limits that the American delegation regarded as the necessary foundation of the effective international control. The walkout was a specific dramatic gesture of the American drug control advocacy that the 1920s was conducting in the specific moralistic register of the country that had imposed domestic prohibition and that regarded the international opium trade as the specific moral equivalent of the alcohol trade that it was attempting to suppress at home. The Shanghai Commission of 1909, the precursor to the Hague Convention, had established the specific frame for the international drug control discussion that the subsequent decades continued to operate within. The frame of the moral medical problem whose solution was the restriction of the supply, the assumption that the demand was a fixed and manageable quantity that the reduction of the supply would address, the structural forces that produced the demand, the poverty, the trauma, the social conditions that made the opioids' temporary relief attractive to the specific populations most exposed to those conditions, were not the frame within which the international drug control effort was operating in the 1920s. The Turkish dimension of the international drug control effort was the dimension that the specific post-war political geography of the former Ottoman territories made most complicated. The Anatolian opium production, the specific high-quality opium that the Turkish and Greek regions of the former Ottoman Empire had been producing for the international pharmaceutical market, and that the post-war political disruption had partially redirected toward the criminal market, was the supply chain element, in that the international regulation was most urgently attempting to address and least successfully managing. The new Turkish Republic, the specific nationalist government of Mustafa Kemal that had emerged from the post-war chaos to establish the modern Turkish state, had the specific complex relationship with the opium control effort that any new state with a significant economic interest in the crop being regulated would have. The Turkish opium was a revenue source. The Turkish compliance with the International Opium Control Framework was the compliance of the state that was negotiating the specific terms of its participation in the international order, while managing the specific economic realities of the agricultural population whose livelihoods the crop supported. The Persia-Afghanistan corridor, the specific geographic route through which the opium from the Persian and Afghan territories was moving into the European market, was the supply chain element that the WWI, international regulation, had the least capacity to address, operating at the intersection of the specific sovereign territories of states that were at the margins of the League's effective reach, and through the specific geographic terrain that the law enforcement infrastructure of the 1920s could not effectively monitor. The specific failure of the 1920s international drug control effort was not the failure of the individuals who staffed the League's Drug Control Committee or negotiated the international conventions, many of whom were genuinely committed to the regulatory goals and worked with considerable skill within the specific constraints of the international system they were operating in. The failure was the structural failure of the international regulatory regime, whose effectiveness depended on the voluntary compliance of sovereign states whose individual interests did not consistently align with the collective interest that the regime was designed to serve. The specific structural limitation of international governance that the 20th century would repeatedly encounter across a wide range of regulatory domains, and that the drug control effort encountered with particular acuity. The heroin that was arriving in Paris in the mid-1920s was arriving despite the specific international regulatory framework that the League's Drug Control Committee had developed. The framework was developing. The supply was also developing. The development of the supply was outpacing the development of the regulation. And the specific human consequences of that gap were the specific human consequences of the people in the cafes of Montparnasse who were purchasing the product of the specific international supply chain that the specific inadequate international regulation had failed to stop. Chapter 12. The Legacy. What the 1920s Paris heroin crisis left behind and how it shaped the century that followed. The decade ended. The crisis did not. For a specific historical moment of the 1920s, Paris heroin craze. The culturally visible, aesthetically embedded, bohemian adjacent drug use that the mythology of the lost generation has partly obscured and that this account has attempted to recover, was a moment that ended with the decade that had contained it, but the specific elements that had constituted the moment did not end with it. They transformed, persisted, reconfigured themselves into the different shapes that the different decades produced. And the specific legacy of the 1920s Paris drug crisis is visible in the subsequent history of drug culture and drug policy and drug addiction in France and in Europe, and in the broader international context that the 1920s had begun to shape. The Corsican networks that had established themselves in the Marseille and Paris drug trade of the 1920s became the networks that the mid-20th century French Connection was built on. The specific criminal infrastructure whose 1920s formation was the foundation, whose subsequent decades of development produced the heroin supply chain that the American market of the 1950s and 1960s would depend on. The specific criminal organizations that the 1920s drug trade had assembled in the specific geographic and economic context of the post-war French underworld were the organizations whose organizational learning and institutional relationships persisted across the decades, adapting to the changing regulatory environment and the changing market conditions while maintaining the specific structural position in the supply chain that the 1920s had established. The French Connection, the heroin pipeline, from the Turkish opium fields through the Marseille processing laboratories to the American market that the U.S. enforcement operations of the 1960s and 1970s would target was not a creation of the mid-20th century. It was the mature form of the supply chain whose earliest infrastructure the 1920s had built. The specific Corsican criminal networks, the specific Marseille port facilities, the specific French pharmaceutical processing industry, whose legitimate capacity the criminal networks had learned to divert. These were the elements that the 1920s had assembled and that the subsequent decades had developed. The literary legacy of the 1920s drug culture was the legacy that the specific documentary and artistic work of the period's drug users left in the cultural record, not as the idealized romantic vision of the drug as liberation that the mythology tends to produce, but as the more complicated, more honest account that the best work of the period actually offered. Cocteau's Opium Diary was a specific literary artifact of the addiction experience, whose honesty about both the drug seductions and its costs established a model for the addiction memoir that the subsequent century of recovery literature would follow and extend. The modernist literature's complicated relationship with the drug culture, the oblique selective documentation that Hemingway and the others produced, left a different kind of legacy. The legacy of the record that is most useful precisely because of its omissions, the cultural document whose silences reveal the specific social realities that the explicit account could not or would not address. The reading of the lost generation literature against its silences, the recovery of the drug culture that the mythology had elided, is the specific historical task that this account has attempted to contribute to, and the larger project of which it is a part. The specific medical legacy of the 1920s drug crisis was the legacy of the clinical experience that the period's physicians had accumulated, and that the subsequent development of addiction medicine would build on. The specific French tradition of the addiction medicine, the clinical approach to the detoxification and the recognition of the addiction as a medical condition requiring medical treatment rather than exclusively moral condemnation, developed through the interwar period in the specific context of the clinical experience that the 1920s crisis had generated. The physicians who had treated the heroin addicts of Montparnasse in the 1920s were the physicians who were training the subsequent generation of clinicians whose work would constitute the foundation of the 20th century French addiction medicine. The specific policy legacy of the 1920s drug crisis in France was the legacy of the regulatory evolution that the crisis had accelerated. The tightening of the pharmaceutical regulation, the development of the criminal enforcement apparatus, the specific institutional forms of the French drug policy that the subsequent decades would develop and revise in response to the changing character of the drug problem. The specific French approach to the drug question, the combination of the criminal enforcement and the medical treatment that the French system has continued to develop and refine through the subsequent century, has its specific roots in the regulatory and institutional responses that the 1920s crisis had generated. The international legacy was the legacy of the specific precedents that the 1920s drug control effort had established, the precedents of the international regulatory framework, the multinational convention, the international monitoring body, and the specific institutional architecture of the international drug control regime that the subsequent decades would build on, revise, and argue about. The League's Drug Control Committee was the institutional ancestor of the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime. The specific institutional lineage of the international drug control effort traces its origins to the specific 1920s institutional innovations that the opium crisis had generated. The cultural legacy was perhaps the most ambiguous, the legacy of the specific moment when the drug use had been embedded in the cultural production of a genuinely extraordinary artistic community, and when the relationship between the drug and the art had been intensely debated and deeply mythologized. The mythology of the drug-using artist, the idea that the altered consciousness of the drug use was compatible with, or even necessary for, the specific creative work of the modernist tradition, was a mythology that the 1920s Paris drug culture had helped to produce, and that the subsequent decades of drug culture had inherited and elaborated. The specific empirical reality behind the mythology was the reality that this account has tried to document. The reality that the drug use in the 1920s Paris artistic community was a complicated mixture of the genuine experiment and the desperate dependency, that the relationship between the drug and the creative output was variable and often negative rather than consistently positive, that the artists whose work survived and whose reputations endure were in many cases the artists who managed their relationship with the drug rather than the artists who were managed by it. The mythology of the bohemian drug use selected for the experiment and elided the dependency. The historical record recovered in the police files and the medical records and the biographies and the memoirs contains both. Chapter 13: The Survivors, Who Made It Out and Why, and What the Patterns Reveal. The more interesting historical question is not who was destroyed. The destroyed are well documented. The biographies note the specific years of the decline and the specific circumstances of the death and the specific tragic arc of the trajectory that the opioid addiction produced in the specific individual cases of the people who did not recover. The documentation of the destroyed is the documentation of the conclusive. The life that ended in the way that the addiction's pharmacology predicted, whose ending the historical record can mark with the specific date and the specific circumstances that the biography requires. The more interesting question is the question of the survivors, the people who encountered the heroin of 1920s Paris, who used it in the specific social context of the bohemian community, who experienced the specific pharmacological seductions and the specific progressive demands of the opioid dependency, and who nevertheless emerged from the decade with their lives and their creative work, and their capacity for the continued engagement with the world that the addiction had threatened to eliminate. The survivors are the more interesting historical subjects, precisely because their survival requires explanation, and the explanation reveals the specific individual and social and institutional factors that made the recovery possible. Cocteau survived. The specific circumstances of Cocteau's survival were the circumstances that the documentation of his addiction and recovery makes available. The specific combination of the genuine desire to recover, the social connections that made the private clinic accessible, the specific creative investment in the documentation of the recovery experience that gave the process of the cure the additional meaning of the artistic project, and the specific supportive relationships that the bohemian community offered the person in recovery who had the social capital to claim them. The pattern that Cocteau's survival represents is the pattern of the socially embedded, creatively motivated, institutionally supported recovery. The recovery that happened in the specific context of the person who had the resources to access the treatment and the social relationships to support the post-treatment period, and the professional identity to provide the motivation for the sustained sobriety that the recovery required. The pattern is not universal. Many people who shared Cocteau's social position did not recover, and many people who lacked his resources did, but the specific identifying features of his recovery are legible in the historical record, and they reveal the specific conditions that made the survival possible. The American expatriates who returned to the United States at the end of the decade, the specific population movement of the Depression's economic pressure, were returning to a different social environment, one in which the specific cultural context of the drug use was absent, and in which the specific social and professional pressures of the American context provided the particular external motivations for the sustained sobriety that the Parisian milieu had not provided. The person who had used heroin in Paris as a specific cultural gesture found the cultural context of the gesture absent in the Depression-era United States, and the gesture correspondingly more difficult to maintain. The specific mechanisms of the recovery that the survivors, one, employed, the specific strategies and the specific resources and the specific social supports that made the sustained sobriety possible were the mechanisms that the 1920s Parisian context made available, and their specific character reveals the specific practical dimensions of the recovery that the theoretical frameworks of the period's addiction medicine had not yet articulated. The social support of the non-using members of the Bohemian community, the friends and the colleagues who maintained the relationship with the person in recovery and who provided the specific social connection to the world outside the drug use that the recovery required, was the social support that the specific community structure of the Bohemian milieu made available to the person who could claim it. The geographic displacement was the specific strategy that the historical record documents in the cases of the survivors who chose it. The deliberate departure from the specific social environment of the drug use as the mechanism for the disruption of the specific conditioned associations and the social networks through which the drug had been obtained, and that the recovery required disrupting. The person who left Paris for the south of France, or for the countryside, or for the return to the country of origin, was the person who was choosing the geographic disruption as the mechanism for the behavioral disruption that the recovery required. The creative work was the specific motivational factor in the survival of the artists, whose recovery the historical record documents, the specific investment in the creative project, whose continuation required the sustained capacity that the addiction was impairing, and whose specific demands provided the motivation for the recovery that the addiction's pharmacology was undermining. The artist who is in the middle of the novel or the painting or the musical composition, whose completion required the sustained mental function that the heroin was progressively eliminating, had the specific concrete motivation for the recovery that the person whose investment in the future was less specific and less immediate did not have. The pattern of the survival recovered from the specific cases of the people who did recover from the heroin of 1920s Paris reveals the specific consistent features of the recovery that the subsequent century of addiction medicine and addiction research has identified as the factors that support the sustained sobriety, the social support of the non-using community, the specific motivation provided by the valued activity or relationship or project, the access to the clinical treatment for the acute phase of the withdrawal, the geographic or environmental disruption of the conditioned associations, and the social networks of the drug use, and the specific sustained engagement with the post-acute recovery that the addiction's long-term character requires. The 1920s, Paris did not know these features in the systematic research-supported form that the subsequent addiction medicine has articulated them. The survivors did not, in most cases, have access to the systematic support for their recovery that the contemporary addiction medicine would prescribe. They found their way through the specific, available resources of their specific individual situations. The social connections they had maintained, the creative projects they were committed to, the specific circumstances that had provided the motivation and the opportunity for the recovery that the available evidence suggests was more difficult, more precarious, and more solitary than it needed to be. Chapter 14. The Myth and the Memory. How the 1920s. Paris drug culture was remembered, forgotten, and selectively recovered. The mythology of the lost generation was constructed, like all mythologies, out of a selection. The selection was made by the survivors, the people who wrote the memoirs, and the retrospective accounts, who gave the interviews and the lectures, who shaped the canonical version of the decade through the specific, selective presentation of the experience that the mythology required. The memoir is not the history. The memoir is the history that the person whose life it documents has decided to present, and the decisions about what to include and what to exclude, the specific editorial choices of the person who is simultaneously the subject and the author, are the decisions that produce the mythology rather than the record. The memoirs of the 1920s. Paris survivors are the specific literary artifacts whose selective presentation of the decade's experience reveals the specific editorial choices that the mythology's construction required. Hemingway's A Movable Feast, published posthumously in 1964, written in the early 1960s from the perspective of the elderly writer reconstructing the experience of his young adulthood, is the specific canonical text of the lost generation mythology and the specific canonical example of the selective memoir. The Paris that Hemingway reconstructed in A Movable Feast is the Paris of the poverty and the writing and the friendship and the specific literary ambition. The Paris from which the drug culture has been substantially removed. The removal was not accidental. Hemingway was making specific editorial choices about the Paris he wanted to present, choices that reflected both the specific demands of the mythological project he was engaged in and the specific personal decisions that the person reconstructing a period of intense, complicated experience makes about which aspects of the experience to illuminate and which to leave in shadow. The drug culture of Montparnasse was in the shadow that Hemingway chose for it. The French literary tradition of the 1920s drug experience, the tradition that Cocteau most prominently represents, was a more honest tradition in its specific literary engagement with the drug experience, precisely because it was a tradition of the confession rather than the mythology. Cocteau's Opium Diary confesses, it does not mythologize, the specific literary honesty of the confession genre, the tradition that De Quincey had established and that Cocteau was extending, is the honesty of the person who has decided that the full account of the experience, including its most difficult and least flattering dimensions, is the specific literary project worth attempting. The academic history of the 1920s. Paris, the scholarly literature that the subsequent decades have produced on the interwar period, the lost generation, the Parisian avant-garde, has been reconstructing the drug culture with increasing completeness as the specific archival sources have become more accessible and as the scholarly interest in the history of drug policy and drug culture has grown. The police archives, the medical records, the diplomatic documents of the international drug control effort. These are the specific archival sources whose systematic consultation has allowed the scholarly recovery of the drug culture that the mythology had obscured. The specific Scholarly recovery of the 1920s. Paris drug culture is part of the broader project of the social history of the interwar period. The project of recovering the experience of the period in its full social complexity, including the experiences that the canonical texts and the canonical figures had excluded from the mythology. The recovery is not the project of the exposure or the debunking. It is the project of the completeness, the project of the history that includes the dimensions of the experience that the mythology had decided were not mythology appropriate. The popular memory of the 1920s Paris, the specific cultural memory that the museum exhibitions and the cinema and the tourist industry have produced, and that the general educated public consumes, has been slower to incorporate the drug culture than the scholarly literature. The mythology of the decade retains its specific golden haze, the champagne and the jazz and the expatriate writers and the fashion revolution, and the heroine occupies a footnote position in the popular account rather than the integrated structural role that the historical evidence supports. The specific cultural reasons for the continued marginalization of the drug culture in the popular memory of the 1920s Paris are the reasons that the mythology always has for its omissions, the reasons of the romantic, the reasons of the commercially marketable, the reasons of the version of the past that the present can use for its own specific cultural purposes. The 1920s Paris of the popular imagination is a usable past, a specific historical moment whose specific qualities of cultural brilliance and personal freedom and social experimentation the present can invoke as a counter-image to the specific present conditions that the invocation is intended to critique or celebrate. The heroine doesn't fit in the usable past in the way that the champagne does. The heroine complicates the mythology. The complication is the reason to include it. Chapter 15. The hidden users. The people. The mythology never mentions. The drug culture below the famous names. The history of the 1920s Paris heroin crisis has a celebrity problem. The specific problem is the problem of all histories that are reconstructed primarily from the documentary record that the famous leave behind. The problem that the famous are overrepresented in the archive and the ordinary are underrepresented, that the person who published the memoir and received the biographer produces the specific documentary density that makes historical reconstruction possible, while the person who left no memoir and received no biographer produces the specific archival silence that makes historical reconstruction difficult. The heroine of 1920s Paris has been recovered to the extent that it has been recovered primarily through the records of the famous, the Cocteau diary, the biographical accounts of the named artists and writers, the specific documented cases of the people whose involvement with the drug was noted because their involvement with everything was noted. The history below the famous names is the history that the police records and the hospital admission logs and the court documents and the social welfare files contain. The specific institutional documentation of the people whose encounter with heroin was recorded, not because they were famous, but because the specific institutional processes of the enforcement and the medical system and the welfare bureaucracy had processed them through the administrative machinery that leaves the documentary trace. The concierge's daughter is in the police records. Her name appears in the Brigade Mondaine files for the year 1926. The erreur, specific, administrative entry of the arrest for possession of a small quantity of the substance whose street name the filing clerk has entered in the column designated for it. She is 23 years old. She is employed as a seamstress in the specific, garment industry of the 3rd arrondissement, whose workers constitute one of the largest female employment populations of 1920s Paris. She lives in the specific small apartment of the working-class residential building, whose concierge is her mother. She encountered the heroine through the specific social network of her workplace. The seamstresses who shared the specific, cramped, inadequately ventilated workshop were the specific physical demands of the work, and the specific social proximity of the workers created the conditions for the sharing of the various means of relief from the working day that the workshop's culture made available. She is not in Hemingway. She is not in Cocteau. She is not in the mythology of the lost generation in any of its forms. She is in the police file for 1926, and the police file notes her address and her age and her occupation and the quantity of the substance and the disposition of the case, a fine, suspended, and nothing else. The history that would recover her experience fully does not exist because the documentary record that would support it does not exist. What the police file offers is the specific, sparse evidence of her existence in the drug culture of 1920s. Paris, the evidence that the heroine of Montparnasse and Montmartre was not exclusively the heroine of the famous and the bohemian and the culturally positioned, but the heroine of the city in all of its social variety. The factory worker and the shop girl and the seamstress and the domestic servant. The specific large female working class population of 1920s Paris, whose working and living conditions were the conditions of the urban poor in the specific, economically unstable post-war city, were encountering heroin through the specific social networks of their own communities rather than through the social networks of the bohemian left bank. The drug's presence in the working class neighborhoods of Paris. The specific arrondissements of the East and the North, whose social character was the character of the industrial and commercial working class rather than the artistic and intellectual bohemia, is documented in the police records and the court files with the specific spare documentation of the institutional record rather than the specific literary elaboration of the memoir. The male factory worker who had returned from the Western Front with the specific combination of the physical wound and the morphine habituation that the military medical system had produced was the specific demographic figure whose encounter with heroin in post-war Paris was the encounter of the person whose opioid dependency had predated the peace and whose search for the continuation of the relief that the military hospital's morphine had provided led him to the specific criminal supply chain that the 1920s Paris had developed. The veteran addict was not the bohemian experimenter. He was the person whose dependency had a specific medical origin in the wartime pain management, and whose continuation of the opioid use after the demobilization was the continuation of the pharmacological relief, whose initial prescription had been the military medical system's standard response to the injury that the Western Front produced. The specific demographic reality of the veteran addict in 1920s Paris, the scale of the population of men who had returned from the war with the opioid dependency that the military medical system had produced, is a reality that the historical record documents imperfectly, because the veteran addict was the person whose specific social position made the documentation of his addiction the documentation of a failure that the post-war French culture was not eager to attribute to its veterans. The veterans were the heroes of the Republic. The heroes of the Republic were not supposed to be heroin addicts. The specific institutional reluctance to document the veteran addiction was the reluctance of the society that needed the heroic narrative and found the addiction narrative incompatible with it. The North African immigrant population of 1920s Paris. The specific large community of Algerian and Moroccan workers whose labor the post-war industrial economy required and whose social position in the city was the position of the racially marginalized, economically exploited, residentially segregated immigrant community, was the population whose encounter with the drug culture of Paris was the encounter of the specific community most targeted by the press's Orientalist framing and least protected by the institutional structures of the French welfare system. The specific documented presence of the Kiev and the hashish in the North African community of Paris had been established in the pre-war period and persisted in the post-war city, and the specific transition from the traditional cannabis preparations to the heroin that the post-war supply chain was making available was the transition that the specific social and economic vulnerabilities of the immigrant population made particularly consequential. The homosexual community of 1920s Paris, the specific semi-visible community of men whose same-sex relationships occupied the specific, legally and socially precarious position of the penal code's tolerance without acceptance, had its own relationship with the drug culture of the decade. A relationship whose specific character reflected the specific social conditions of the community whose members were managing the additional constant vulnerability of the criminalized identity alongside whatever other vulnerabilities the drug use produced. The specific social spaces of the homosexual community in 1920s. Paris, the particular bars and clubs and private gatherings of the community whose geography the studies of the period have begun to map, were spaces in which the drug culture was present in the specific overlapping way of the communities that share the geography of the underground. The specific North African brothel of the 18th arrondissement, whose police file from 1927 records the simultaneous raid for the prostitution offense and the drug possession charge, is the specific institutional document that places the heroin in the specific social geography of the working class entertainment and vice economy. The geography that is several miles from Montparnasse in both the physical and the social sense, that shares nothing with the bohemian mythology of the artistic cafe, and that is as much a part of the 1920s Paris drug culture as the select literary gathering in the private studio of the named artist. The children are in the records too, the specific disturbing presence of the adolescent users in the juvenile court files and the hospital admission records of the late 1920s. The specific documentation of the drug's penetration into the youth population of the working class neighborhoods through the specific social networks of the street and the workplace, and the casual labor economy that the adolescent members of the working poor navigated. The juvenile court magistrate who wrote the specific concerned notation in the case file of the 16-year-old arrested in the Pigalle district in 1928 was the magistrate who was seeing the specific early signs of the pattern that the subsequent decades of the French drug crisis would elaborate, the pattern of the drugs movement through the social structure from the bohemian and the marginalized to the young and the vulnerable. But the recovery of these hidden users adds to the account of the 1920s. Paris heroin crisis is the specific social breadth that the mythology has obscured. The mythology concentrates on the famous and the bohemian because the famous and the bohemian produce the documentary record that makes the historical recovery possible, and because the famous and the bohemian are the figures whose cultural position makes the mythology of the decade legible. But the heroine of 1920s. Paris was not the exclusive property of the artistic community or the specific culture of transgression that the bohemian milieu had developed. It was the drug of the city, present in the factory district, and the immigrant neighborhood, and the working class cafe, and the juvenile court file, with the same pharmacological consistency that it was present in the studio and the literary salon. The full social breadth of the drug crisis is the dimension of the crisis that the policy response requires understanding, and that the mythology consistently obscures. The policy that addresses only the famous is the policy designed for the mythology rather than for the city. The city contained the seamstress in the police file, and the veteran in the hospital admission record, and the adolescent in the juvenile court file, alongside the artist in the literary memoir. And the history that recovers all of them is the history that the policy requires. Conclusion: the full picture. Why the heroin of 1920s? Paris matters and what it tells us about the decade and about ourselves returned to the cafe. You're in Paris. It is 1924. The coffee is still excellent. The ashtray has still not been emptied since Tuesday. The two Americans at the next table have resolved their argument about Hemingway in the specific, inconclusive way of arguments about genius, which is to say, they have not resolved it and are now arguing about something else. The woman with the red lipstick has put down her manuscript and is looking out of the window with the expression of the person who has just decided something. You know more now than you did when you sat down. You know that the golden decade of the popular mythology, the specific, extraordinary cultural moment of the interwar Paris, was also the specific, complicated social reality of the post-war city, whose relationship with heroin was more extensive and more consequential than the mythology has allowed. You know that the supply chain of the drug ran from the Turkish opium fields through the criminal networks of the Corsican organized crime and the dislocated pharmaceutical industry to the cafes and studios and private apartments of the Bohemian left bank. You know that the cultural logic of the transgressive gesture, the Bohemians' systematic rejection of the bourgeois convention, made the drug use comprehensible in its own context, while the pharmacology of the opioid made its consequences inevitable in ways that the cultural logic could not prevent. You know that the women who used heroin faced the specific double burden of the pharmacological consequences and the gendered moral condemnation that the social structure of the period imposed on the female transgressor. You know that the enforcement was inadequate, the treatment was inadequate, the international coordination was inadequate, and that the inadequacy of all three was a specific human cost paid by specific individual people whose names appear in the police files and the medical records and the biographies and the obituaries of the period. What does it tell us? This recovery of the heroin of 1920s Paris, this restoration of the dimension of the lost generations experience that the mythology had elided. It tells us something important about the relationship between the drug and the culture. The specific way that the drug's presence in a cultural moment is never simply the drug's presence, never simply the pharmacological event of the substance interacting with the nervous system, but always the intersection of the pharmacology with the specific social conditions and the specific cultural logics and the specific economic realities that have shaped the demand for the drug and the supply that addresses it. The heroin of 1920s Paris was not an alien intrusion into an otherwise coherent cultural moment. It was an element of the moment itself, produced by the same forces that produced the Cubist painting and the modernist novel and the jazz club and the couture house. Understanding the moment requires understanding the heroin, in the same way that it requires understanding the champagne and the jazz, as a feature of the specific social and cultural world that the decade assembled, not as an aberration from it. It tells us something important about the mythology of the creative life. The specific, persistent mythology of the relationship between the altered consciousness and the artistic production that the Romantic tradition established, and that the 1920s Paris drug culture helped to elaborate. The mythology is seductive because it addresses a genuine question. The question of where the creative work comes from, what conditions the creative insight requires, whether the normal, sober social self is the self from which the best work emerges, or whether there is some other self, accessible through the specific, disruptive means that the drug provides, that is capable of the creative work that the normal self cannot manage. The historical evidence from 1920s Paris is the evidence against the simple version of the mythology. The evidence that the drug use in the artistic community was more often destructive than generative in its effects on the creative work, that the artists who produced the most enduring work of the period were in many cases the artists who managed their relationship with the drug most successfully, and that the myth of the drug-using artist as the specifically creative artist is the myth of the survivor selected, the handful of people whose drug use and artistic production coincided without the drug eliminating the artistic production, whose stories are visible because they survive to tell them, whose visibility in the historical record creates the impression of a general pattern that the full record does not support. It tells us something important about the specific structural conditions that produce the drug crisis, the conditions that the 1920s Paris drug crisis makes visible in the specific way that historical distance makes the structural visible, in ways that contemporaries, embedded in the crisis, often cannot see. The heroin crisis of 1920s Paris was not produced by the moral weakness of the individuals who used heroin, or by the criminal enterprise of the people who supplied it, though both of those factors were present and consequential. It was produced by the specific intersection of the post-war trauma and the economic disruption and the regulatory failure and the international supply chain development and the cultural logic of the transgressive gesture that the specific social conditions of the post-war period had assembled. The structural conditions produced the crisis. The individuals experienced it. The policy implication of this structural understanding. The implication that the 1920s Paris heroin crisis and its aftermath demonstrate for the present is the implication that the drug crisis is not primarily a problem of individual moral failure requiring individual moral correction, nor primarily a problem of criminal enterprise requiring criminal suppression, but a problem of the specific structural conditions that produce the demand and the supply and the cultural logic that connects them. The addressing of the structural conditions, the trauma, the economic desperation, the cultural logics that frame the drug use as liberation or as refuge, is the addressing that the enforcement alone cannot achieve, and that the moral condemnation alone cannot achieve, and that the specific institutional forms of the regulatory response have historically been inadequate to achieve. The 1920s Paris drug crisis ended, or rather transformed, when the structural conditions that had produced it changed. The economic conditions of the Depression eliminated the specific bohemian economy that had made the drug use viable. The political crisis of the 1930s transformed the cultural logic that had framed the drug use as liberation. The regulatory tightening of the late 1920s and early 1930s changed the character of the supply. The structural change produced the transformation of the crisis. The individual enforcement actions and the individual moral condemnations had not. It tells us something important about the relationship between memory and history. The specific way that the mythology of a period performs, the selective recovery that the mythology requires, and the specific way that the historical project of the full account, the account that includes the heroin alongside the champagne, the dependency alongside the experiment, the police file alongside the published novel, is the project of recovering the full complexity of the human experience that the mythology has simplified. The lost generation was lost in a more specific way than the mythology allows. They were lost to the war that had destroyed the world they had grown up in and the values that world had offered them. They were lost to the specific disorienting freedom of the expatriate life in the specific extraordinary city that Paris in the 1920s was. They were lost, some of them, in the specific pharmacological way of the person whose encounter with the opioid had produced the specific dependency that the pharmacology of the drug generates, regardless of the cultural sophistication of the person experiencing it. And they were found, some of them, in the specific ways that people find themselves in the aftermath of the encounter with the drug and the world it had opened, in the creative work that the recovery made possible, in the relationships that had survived the dependency, in the specific hard-won clarity of the person who had seen the drug's seductions clearly enough to step back from them, and who carried the knowledge of that seeing into the rest of their life. The heroin of 1920s. Paris is in the historical record. It has always been there for the person who looks in the police archives and the medical files and the diplomatic documents and the biographies and the memoirs and the letters and the specific oblique passages in the canonical texts of the decade where the authors registered the presence of the drug without fully naming it. The recovery of that record, the integration of the drug culture into the full account of the decade that the mythology has partially excluded it from, is not the project of the exposure or the debunking. It is the project of the honesty that the people who lived through the decade and the people who study it both deserve. The coffee in the cafe is still excellent. The woman with the red lipstick has made her decision. What decision the historical record does not specify, but the person who has been reading the manuscript with the focused attention of the person who is either editing or crying has put the manuscript away and is looking at the street with the expression of the person who has decided to go out into it. The two Americans are still arguing. The piano in the back room has achieved neither greater skill nor lesser conviction. Paris in 1924 was the specific, extraordinary, complicated, brilliant, and deeply damaged place that it was. The heroin was part of it. The history that excludes the heroin is the history that makes the period simpler and more palatable and less true. The truth, specific, complicated, sometimes ugly, always instructive, is better. Let it back in.